Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Biology 6 Reproductive Systems lecture. At the end of part 1, we were about halfway through the female reproductive cycle. I'm going to spend just a few minutes reviewing what we've already covered on the female reproductive cycle, and then we will continue on that subject.
Roughly once a month. The actual time is on average 28 days, but we usually say once a month. The woman's reproductive organs go through some changes related to her fertility, and we call that her reproductive cycle. But some of those changes are going on inside the woman's ovaries, and some of those changes are going on inside her uterus. And so the reproductive cycle is divided into what they call the uterine cycle, the changes in the uterus, and the ovarian cycle, the changes that go on inside the ovary. And so what I'm going to do is basically show the whole reproductive cycle, and in some parts I'll be talking about the uterine cycle, in some parts I'll be talking about the ovarian cycle. You'll know, depending on whether we're talking about the ovary or the uterus. But because it's a 28-day cycle, I've made a little graphic on the whiteboard over there. Just by definition, the day one of a woman's reproductive cycle is the first day of her menstruation, which is, we call it her menses. And 28 is the last day of her cycle, but since it's a cycle, circles keep looping around. After the end of 28, day 28, the next day is day one of the next cycle. That's what I was trying to say over there. All right, let me switch over to here for a second. This figure here focuses in on the ovarian cycle, what's going on in the ovaries during the first part of the 28-day cycle. Basically days 1 through 14 are what they're showing here. And the way it works is like this. During that first part of that cycle, her pituitary gland is making two hormones. One is called LH and the other is called FSH. And you don't have to know what they stand for, but LH is luteinizing hormone and FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. And in the first half of this cycle, day 1 through 14, the FSH is the more important of those two. And what it does is stimulate one of the follicles in her ovaries. A follicle is a structure inside her ovary that houses an egg. Each follicle is one egg surrounded by some supporting cells. And her ovary has hundreds of thousands of these follicles in it, but the egg inside the follicle is immature. It's just not able to be fertilized by a sperm in this immature state. Well, the follicle stimulating hormone does pretty much what you'd guess from its name. It stimulates one of the follicles. And so on day 1 through 13, under the influence of that follicle stimulating hormone, one follicle gets larger and larger and larger, and the egg is maturing. And so by the time day 14 comes along, that egg inside the follicle is mature and is able to be fertilized by a sperm. But the thing is that that egg has to be ovulated out of the ovary. No sperm are allowed inside the ovary. And so on day 14 is when ovulation occurs. The follicle opens up and the egg is ejected out of the ovary, and then now that egg is available for fertilization. And what triggers the ovulation is a sudden increase in those FSH and LH hormones from the pituitary. I mean, as you can see from the graph, they've been increasing on days 1 through 13 anyway. But on day 14, on ovulation day, there's a sudden and dramatic increase in both of them. And that spike, as they call it, is the signal to the ovary, ovulate the egg, release the egg, because it's day 14. Okay, so day 14 is ovulation day. It's a good point. So by definition, the first day of menstrual flow, the period, is day 1, and so typically it's about the first 3 or 4 days of her cycle.
Oh, okay, that's when we're cleaning out.
Right. What it is, it's the menstrual flow is the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus from the previous cycle. And so on the first 3 or 4 days of a new cycle, it's getting rid of the endometrium from the previous cycle. That's what the menstrual flow is. It's okay. So I guess I'd say ovulation occurs roughly 14 days, 2 weeks after the first day of menstrual flow. All right. Sure, no, good questions. All right, and so I think I also started talking about, well, maybe I didn't talk about, maybe I'll talk about it here. Oh yeah, so what happens to the empty follicle? So after ovulation, the follicle is empty, so you would think that its mission in life would be done. It's ovulated its egg, and that would be the end of it. But actually, it has another role to play. As soon as it's ovulated the egg, the empty follicle reorganizes itself into a new structure called the corpus luteum, which means yellow body. And this corpus luteum structure becomes an endocrine gland. It starts making large amounts of two of the female's sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, you might remember the follicle was already making estrogen. Even before it ovulated the egg, it was making estrogen. And does anybody remember what that estrogen was doing? You're kind of along the right track. The estrogen goes to the woman's ovary and causes a new endometrium to develop, the endometrium being the inner lining of the ovary. And yeah, so on days 1 through 13, the follicle is making estrogen to generate a new endometrium inside the uterus in preparation for the egg to implant there if it needs to, if she gets pregnant. So anyway, I'm pointing here, so that after day 14, after ovulation, it continues to make estrogen, but it's making a new hormone, progesterone, that it wasn't making before. And that progesterone, oh, actually, before I go any further, one quick note about this corpus luteum. The corpus luteum needs luteinizing hormone, LH, from the pituitary to survive. You can almost think of the LH from the pituitary as being the food that the corpus luteum needs to stay alive. And keep that thought somewhere in your short-term memory, because we're going to come back to it, that the corpus luteum needs LH to survive. Oh yeah, so I was going to say, what does that progesterone do? The progesterone goes to the endometrium and makes it sticky. And the reason that that's important, well, it's important for a couple of reasons. One is it needs to be sticky so that the egg can implant, because that's where that egg, if it's a fertilized egg, if it's a zygote, it will need to stay inside the uterus for 9 months, and so it darn well better stick to the endometrium. And the other thing that it's important for the endometrium to be sticky is the endometrium needs to stick to the wall of the uterus, because if it doesn't stick, it will slough, the endometrium will slough off, and that will be the end of that egg, right? You know, because it will leave her body in the menstrual flow. And you know, in a sense, the body wants to be pregnant, and so the corpus luteum is making the progesterone, because the progesterone keeps the endometrium sticky, and therefore stops her from menstruating, so that the egg, you know, can stay in there and develop into the baby. And incidentally, that's why if a woman has her period, she knows that she's not pregnant, because if she's pregnant, it stays sticky, so she doesn't get her menstrual flow. But if she is not pregnant, there is no progesterone being made, and or I should say the progesterone decreases, and so by the end of the 28 days, her endometrium is no longer sticky, and then it sloughs off. Okay, so anyway, the point I was making is that the corpus luteum inside the, you know, that's the empty follicle, is making progesterone, and that sustains the pregnancy by keeping the endometrium sticky. Okay, now, so what's going to happen next in this story of the reproductive cycle? What happens next is really going to depend on whether she gets pregnant on that reproductive cycle. And so let me first go through what happens if she does not get pregnant, and then we'll go through it a second time and talk about, you know, what's changed if she does get pregnant. Okay, so if she does not get pregnant, then the LH levels coming from the pituitary fall. There's less and less of this hormone, and the luteinizing hormone was keeping what alive? Corpus luteum, right. Remember, the luteinizing hormone keeps the corpus luteum alive. Well, so what I'm saying is, she doesn't get pregnant, the pituitary makes less and less luteinizing hormone, and so the corpus luteum is going to start getting smaller. And just like a person, if you don't feed a person enough food, they're going to shrink and shrink and shrink and eventually die. Well, that's what happens. If she's not pregnant, the pituitary makes less LH, so therefore the corpus luteum gets smaller and smaller. Come on, get smaller and smaller. And eventually, actually on day 28, it will die. All right, so let's think about this. The corpus luteum died on day 28 from lack of LH if she's not pregnant. So therefore, there's no more progesterone. Therefore, what happens to her endometrium? It sloughs off, right? Because the progesterone from the corpus luteum was keeping the endometrium sticky. So if she's not pregnant, corpus luteum dies, no more progesterone, endometrium is no longer sticky, and so she gets her menstrual flow, which is now the beginning of the next cycle. And so that's why if she's not pregnant, she gets her period starting at the next on the next cycle. And here's kind of the cartoon of that. Yeah, so this is now days 1 through 5 of the next cycle, and since there's no progesterone, the endometrium sloughs off and carrying the unfertilized egg, because we said she was not pregnant, so that egg is unfertilized. Yeah. Oh, what happens to the corpus luteum? That's a good question. I don't 100% know, but I think the cells probably just disintegrate, and then probably the surrounding cells use those as like reuse and recycle those materials for their own use. I'm guessing. Okay, so all that was if she did not get pregnant, and so now we're going to. Oh, so this is just shows it on the graph here. Okay, I think I'm back online. So anyway, it gets smaller and smaller. And eventually dies on day 28 if she's not pregnant. We don't need to see that, so you know all that. Okay. So now I want to go through the reproductive cycle again if she is pregnant. So here's days 1 through 13. Same as we saw before, the pituitary gland is making follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and the follicle-stimulating hormone makes one of the follicles mature. The egg gets larger and is ready to be fertilized. Well, I should say it's able to be fertilized, but it can't yet because it's still inside the ovary. And the follicle is making estrogen. And so again, what's the estrogen doing? It's going to the uterus to do what? Oh, nobody remembers. It's going to the uterus to make a new endometrium grow, because when this egg is ovulated, there darn well better be an endometrium in there for it to stick to. And here you see it, the estrogen going to the uterus and making the endometrium, a new endometrial lining grow. That's called the proliferative phase in the uterine cycle. Remember, the uterine cycle is what's going on in the uterus. The proliferative phase is exactly that, where a new endometrium is growing thanks to that estrogen hormone coming from the follicle. All right, and on day 14, what happens to the pituitary secretion of LH and FSH? It spikes, very good. Here it is. There's a huge gushing, outflowing of those two hormones. And remember, that's the signal that tells the mature follicle, ovulate that egg, because it's day 14. So down it comes. The ovulation occurs. She comes. And so once it's ovulated, now it's available for sperm to fertilize. Where does it go? It goes inside the fallopian tube. Remember, it's going to travel through the fallopian tubes towards the uterus. It takes around 4 days for it to travel through the fallopian tubes. And if it's going to be fertilized by the sperm, that's where it's going to be fertilized on its trip to the ovary. Now, I don't know if I have the cartoon of it getting fertilized here. I'm not sure, but since this is supposed to be the pregnancy one, let's assume that the egg was fertilized as it traveled through there. Okay, so the corpus luteum forms from the empty follicle. It starts making estrogen and progesterone, but again, it needs that LH hormone to keep itself alive. But the progesterone is now the important of those two hormones. The progesterone is what keeps the endometrium sticky, which stops it from sloughing off. In other words, it stops the woman from menstruating that endometrium away, which is what the body wants. The body wants to sustain the pregnancy. Okay, so here's the trick. So if she wasn't pregnant, remember what happened. The corpus luteum died on day 28 from lack of LH, and therefore no more progesterone, and therefore the endometrium was no longer sticky, and she menstruated. But if she is pregnant, the corpus luteum does not die on day 28 or even after day 28. And since the corpus luteum does not die, it keeps making progesterone. And since it keeps making progesterone, she doesn't menstruate, so that the fertilized egg can develop into the baby over the next 9 months. All that sound good so far? All right, and there is the graph showing all of this. If she's not pregnant, then the corpus luteum dies and the endometrium sloughs off. That's what they're trying to, this is the endometrium. You can see it kind of sloughing off and getting smaller. But if she is pregnant, let's see, if she is pregnant, the corpus luteum does not die, it goes well beyond day 28, and so there is no menstruation. The endometrium stays sticky, stays present. Okay, and there's a section in your notes about contraceptives, hormone-based contraceptives, and just for time reasons, I'm not going to go through that in any detail. I'll just say this, that from what I just showed you there on the screen, you can see that if a woman's pregnant, she has sustained high levels of progesterone, right? Because the corpus luteum has to make large amounts of progesterone to stop menstruation from occurring, to keep the endometrium attached and sticky. And so to the body, high levels of progesterone mean pregnancy. And so many of these hormones, hormone-based contraceptives, are just high levels of progesterone. And so they trick the woman's body into thinking she's pregnant. And if the body thinks it's pregnant, it doesn't ovulate any more new eggs. I mean, that would be wasteful of eggs if she was ovulating or she was already pregnant. And so that's the basis of it. She gets lots of progesterone. Her body thinks it's pregnant. No more ovulation. Okay, but yeah, for time considerations, I'm not really going to go into details of those. Let me now focus on a little bit more about the actual fertilization that goes on here. So remember the way it works. She ovulates on day 14. Out comes the egg. And fertilization is where one sperm combines with the egg to make what's sometimes called a fertilized egg, but does anybody remember the official name for it? Zygote, yeah. And so I think we'll see the cartoon of that here. So here the sperm are deposited in the vagina. They swim through the vagina, through the cervix, this opening here at the bottom of the uterus, up into the uterus. Now I showed all the sperm going into this fallopian tube where the egg is, but that's not realistic because the sperm don't know which fallopian tube the egg is in. It could be the left one or it could be the right one. And so about half the sperm go into the empty fallopian tube and then half go into the correct one. You know, typical males, they don't stop to ask directions, right? So but half of them do go up the correct fallopian tube where the egg is, and so then they arrive there at the egg, and yes, several will arrive, but only one will actually penetrate into the egg and fertilize that egg. All right, now here's sort of how the timing of all this works. So we know that she ovulates on day 14. The egg only stays alive for 24 hours. You know, from the moment of ovulation, it only has a 24-hour lifespan to be fertilized. And if it's not fertilized in that time, then the egg dies and it can't, well, obviously can't be fertilized then. So, you know, that's the time period right there when the egg is alive. So at first you might say, well, she can only become pregnant on one day out of her 28-day cycle, right? Because that's where the only days where when the egg is alive. Well, there's actually kind of a trick to it, and here's the trick. Yeah, the egg only stays alive for 24 hours from day 14 to day 15, but sperm can stay alive for 3 days, which is 72 hours, and they can live in her fallopian tubes for all of those 3 days. So if you think about that, if she has intercourse on day 11, then those sperm can stay alive in her fallopian tubes all the way up to day 14, and so she can get pregnant. The sperm will be waiting for the egg to pop out on day 14, or on day 12 if she has intercourse, or day 13 she has intercourse. And any of those days, if she has intercourse, the sperm will stay alive in her fallopian tubes, and they will be able to fertilize the egg on day 14. And so, and it's also true if she has sex anytime on day, intercourse anytime on day 14, because then the egg is there and the sperm will fertilize it. So if you add all that up, that's 4 days. If she has intercourse on days 11, 12, 13, or 14 of her 28-day cycle, then a pregnancy will occur, even though the egg is only alive from day 14 to 15. And here's a cartoon of that. You know, here's days 11, 12, and 13. She has not ovulated yet, but if she has intercourse, yeah, the sperm will just swim up through the vagina and then get into the uterus and then into the fallopian tubes, and they'll just wait there on days 11, 12, or 13, just wait there for the egg to be ovulated, and then they're ready and welcoming and waiting for it, and will then fertilize it on day 14. Does that sound good? And there they go. So yes, intercourse on days 11, 12, or 13, or 14 can lead to fertilization of the egg, so a pregnancy. All right, so let's say the egg has been fertilized, and so it's now officially called a zygote. That's the first cell, the single cell that grows into the baby. The zygote already starts to divide before it's even reached the uterus. So there you see now it's 2 cells, now it's 4 cells. You technically now start calling it an embryo. An embryo is the developing offspring from the moment of fertilization, you know, from that single-celled zygote through the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. You refer to it as an embryo. Here's some photographs. There's a 2-cell embryo. So, you know, it used to be just a single-celled zygote, but then it divided, and so now you have 2 cells. So it's a 2-cell embryo. Then those cells divide. Then it's a 4-cell embryo. Then those cells divide, and you have 8 cells, then 16 cells, then 32 cells, and it keeps getting bigger, a little ball of rapidly dividing cells. I know it doesn't look much like a baby yet, but technically it is an embryo from the moment of fertilization through the first 8 weeks. Okay, so it travels onward through the fallopian tube, and then around day 7 after ovulation, it arrives at the uterus, where its job is to stick to the endometrium, but that's fine. Remember that her corpus luteum is making lots of progesterone, which makes the endometrium sticky, so it will stick very easily to the endometrium. Well, at this stage, when it arrives, when the embryo arrives at the uterus, it has a special name. This stage of the embryo is called the blastocyst, which is not a very appealing name. Hopefully it's not what the parents will name the baby when it's born. Hey, blastocyst, clean your room. And the blastocyst is often described as being a hollow ball of cells with a little clump of cells in the middle. The cells that are on the outside of the blastocyst are called the trophoblast cells, and those are the cells that will become the placenta, which is the organ inside the mom that exchanges nutrients and oxygen and wastes with the developing baby. So the outer cells are the trophoblasts cells, and the inner cells are called the inner cell mass. Those are the ones that will actually develop into the baby. Okay, so the trophoblast implants in the sticky endometrium, and pretty much as soon as it implants, it starts making a hormone called HCG. And again, you don't need to know what that stands for, but if you're curious, it's human chorionic gonadotropin. And what is this HCG, and where's it going, and what is it doing? Well, first of all, this HCG is almost the same as luteinizing hormone, LH. Matter of fact, it's so similar to LH that it can keep the corpus luteum alive. Remember that over there in the ovary, we had the corpus luteum. Here it is. And the corpus luteum was making progesterone. And again, the progesterone is important for what? It keeps the endometrium sticky so the endometrium doesn't slough off and carry the baby off with it. And so, but remember that the corpus luteum only survives if it's getting LH. Well, beyond day 28, the pituitary stops making LH, and so what's going to keep the corpus luteum alive if she's pregnant? What the right? So that is why the blastocyst is making the HCG. The HCG is so similar to luteinizing hormone that it can keep the corpus luteum alive, and that's important because the blastocyst needs the corpus luteum to stay alive to stop the menstruation by making progesterone. So it struck me one day, this is a sort of I'll keep you alive if you keep me alive deal, right? So the trophoblast, the embryo, is keeping the corpus luteum alive by making HCG, and in return the corpus luteum is keeping the blastocyst alive by making progesterone to stop a menstruation from carrying it out of the woman's body. And so, yeah, there you go. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, or you keep me alive, I'll keep you alive deal. No, incidentally, so that HCG is made by the trophoblast, the blastocyst embryo, just within a few days, like a week after the woman's pregnant, and that's the only thing that ever makes this HCG hormone is the blastocyst. And so if there's any HCG in a woman's body anywhere, it means she's pregnant. And so that's the basis of pregnancy tests. A woman can take one of these pregnancy tests where she urinates on this little test strip, and so typically some little lines will change colors in there if she's pregnant. That's what it's detecting. It's detecting HCG hormone. And like I said, it's only made by the blastocyst, which is if she's pregnant. So that's why it's a pregnancy test. And since the blastocyst starts making that hormone, within just a few days, around 7 days after she's pregnant, that's when these pregnancy tests can start detecting pregnancy. I remember my wife and I, our kid is now 13, but 13 or so years ago when we saw that pregnancy test, she said, "Oh, we got the line." And so I grabbed my camera, I ran into the bathroom and took a picture of it. And I tell people this is our first baby picture. There it is. Anyway, so that's what it's detecting. It's detecting the HCG hormone. Okay, so let's follow the developing embryo. So that blastocyst stage that I was showing you was just about a week after pregnancy. It develops quickly. The cells divide rapidly and start forming various structures. At about 4 weeks, you can start to see the shapes of things. That looks like either an arm or a leg, I'm not sure, starting to form there. The cells that will eventually become the heart are already present, and they actually start contracting rhythmically, even at 4 weeks of age. You can start to see them. You can start to see them. Now, there's obviously it's not a fully formed little heart or anything like that, but it is the beginnings of the heart, and they're already beating. Here it is around. This says 7 weeks, but this is around 8 weeks. To me, this one almost looks like a space alien, right? It's got the big head and the big eyes and things like that. By 8 weeks or so, the foundations of the organ systems are all present. And like I say, they're not fully developed yet, but you can at least see the beginnings of the bones and the beginnings of the heart, the beginnings of the lung, and the beginnings of the nervous tissue and things like that. They're at least the foundations are all laid down by week 8. All right, now let's see. Oh, I may show some other parts here. So this you see is the placenta. Remember, that's the organ that exchanges nutrients and water and oxygen and carbon dioxides and wastes and things between the mom and the baby. You can kind of see it. There's a little cord here called the umbilical cord that actually passes those substances from the placenta into the baby's body. And where does that cord plug into the baby? It's where your belly button is. That your belly button is the remnant of where the umbilical cord plugged into you when you were an embryo. As you can see, there's a water-filled balloon-like sac around the baby. That's called the amnion. And the watery liquid inside of it is there to kind of cushion and protect the baby. That's called the amniotic fluid. And when a woman's getting ready to give birth, the amnion breaks and that water flows out of her vagina, that's called her water breaking, and it's a sign that she's getting ready to give birth. Here you see some more development going on. Oh yeah, so remember that officially we call the developing baby an embryo from fertilization through week 8, and then beyond week 8, it's now called a fetus, not an embryo. Oh yeah, so when's it born? Typically around 9 months it takes for gestation to occur, and which is around 40 weeks. It will be ready to be born. All right, and let's see. So while the baby is developing inside the mother, it's important that she live a very healthy lifestyle to get proper nutrients and to avoid things that are potentially toxic, like alcohol and smoking and other drugs, because that can definitely impact the development of the baby after it's born. These children have something called fetal alcohol syndrome, where the mother was an alcoholic and drank lots of alcohol, and it causes various types of birth defects and lower mental ability on the child after the child is born. And so ideally, yeah, no alcohol, no drugs, and no tobacco. All right, and then typically when the babies are born, they're about somewhere between 6 pounds and 10 pounds. You know, that's quite a big of an increase considering it started off as this little one-celled zygote, right? Just 9 months before. So, you know, the baby is growing inside the uterus, which you see here. As the baby develops inside the uterus, obviously the uterus has to get larger, and it stretches upward most. I mean, the uterus starts here inside her pelvic cavity, but as the baby grows, the baby and the uterus grow upward, stretch upward into her abdominal cavity. Here you see a picture here. And that wreaks havoc with some of her abdominal organs. You know, what's in there in her abdominal cavity? Her digestive organs, and so those digestive organs can sometimes be squeezed to a smaller size as the baby's developing, and so she can get some upset stomach. The bladder, which is down here, can also get squeezed to a smaller size, and so she finds herself urinating more often than she used to. Boy, what else? The mother's metabolism increases. She breathes faster because she's not only breathing oxygen for herself, but also for the baby. Her urinary system also increases because, remember, that cleans and balances the blood, but it's not only her blood now, it's the baby's blood as well. Her blood pressure goes up, her heart rate goes up, pretty much all her body functions increase. Her breathing rate goes up because she's now doing them for 2, not just 1. The curvature of her spine increases a little bit to help accommodate the weight of the baby. And something else I think is kind of interesting, her pelvic joint starts to get a little bit more looser. The developing, or I should say the placenta, releases a hormone called relaxin, which travels in the bloodstream to make the joints in her pelvis loose. And that's important because they have to stretch as the baby is going to pass through there. Matter of fact, some women who are pregnant say that they feel all their joints getting looser. You know, they can do stretches and just get more limber than they ever could before they got pregnant. Oh yeah, so here you see, there are the 2 hip bones, and they're joined right there where the pubis comes together right there, the pubis parts of the pelvic bones or the hip bones, and the relaxin loosens that joint right there. Let me talk about the breast development for a moment. And so I skipped this part. Well, you guys can't see this. So if you go backwards in your web handout to just after the part about the birth control, there's a part that says mammary glands, breasts, structures that in females produce the milk for the offspring. So as the baby's developing inside of her, her breasts are developing to prepare themselves to provide milk for the baby. Now there are a couple of hormones that are involved in development of the breast and getting the breast to eject the milk, and both of these hormones come out of the pituitary gland. One is called prolactin, and the other is called oxytocin. And I'll tell you about what their functions on the breast are in a moment. But first, let me mention some things about the breast. So here's the cross-section of the breast. From the outside, you can see there's a pigmented part around the nipple. That's called the areola. And it basically just serves as a visual target for the baby to suck on, so the baby knows where it has to put its mouth to nurse. There are little tubes that carry the milk to the nipple. The tubes closest to the nipple are called lactiferous ducts, and the tubes further away from the nipple, deeper down in the breast, are called alveolar ducts. And if you follow the alveolar ducts, you can see that they showed this sort of golden round things at the end of each alveolar duct. Those are called the alveolar glands. Those are the glands that make the milk. So the milk is made in those glands, then it flows through the alveolar ducts, and then those ducts merge, and now they're called lactiferous ducts, and then the milk comes out the end of the nipple there. All right, so what are those hormones are doing? Well, here's a close-up of some alveolar ducts. Those kind of golden color cells there are the alveolar ducts. Well, the prolactin causes those cells of the alveolar ducts to make milk. They just tell those cells, hey, manufacture milk. It's got water and proteins and some lactose sugar in it. And so, yeah, they start manufacturing the milk. And so the milk pools up inside these hollow spaces inside these alveolar glands. But to make the milk get ejected from the breast, to make the milk flow to the nipple, that requires some contraction of this smooth muscle. Notice there's a smooth muscle layer. Actually, they said myoepithelial cells. I think that's smooth muscle. I think that's their word for smooth muscle. Anyway, so there's smooth muscle there on the outside of these glands. And so when that smooth muscle contracts, it works like a squeeze bulb and squirts the milk towards the nipple. And that's what the oxytocin does. The oxytocin gets that smooth muscle to contract, and that causes the ejection of the milk. And they've done some interesting studies. If a woman is pregnant, or if she's already given birth and she's nursing her baby, if she hears a baby crying, there's a reflex in her brain, and that automatically triggers the oxytocin to be released, and milk will start coming out of her nipples. And it doesn't even have to be her own baby. Any baby crying will be enough to trigger the oxytocin, and her nipples will eject the milk. Now, that oxytocin hormone is also going to have a role in the birthing process. So just for right now, remember that oxytocin has two roles. One is to get this smooth muscle to contract and eject the milk, and the other one, well, I'll just give you a preview. It's to get the smooth muscle of the uterus to contract to help expel the baby, but that will come later on. Okay, so there's the baby, and the weeks are going by, and the baby's getting larger, and like I said, the mom's blood pressure is going up, and her breathing rate is going up, and her heart rate is going up. And let me scroll back down. So now we are in the part of the web handout that says parturition or partum / childbirth. Okay, so the technical term for the baby being born is called parturition or partum, and it just means childbirth. And the events, the things that happen in the mom's body as she's going through the process of childbirth are called labor. Now, one of the first steps of labor is contractions, and what's going on there is the smooth muscle part of the uterus's wall, which is called the myometrium, that's the smooth muscle layer, is contracting to expel the baby. Here you see it. So that pink lining of the part of the uterus there is the myometrium, the smooth muscle layer. And there at the bottom of the uterus, that opening at the bottom is the cervix. And so if the baby is positioned correctly the way it's supposed to, the baby's head is pressing down against the cervix. Well, there's a reflex. There are sensors in the cervix, sensory neurons that detect when the baby's head is pressing against the cervix. And when those sensory neurons detect that the baby's head is pressing against it, a signal is sent up the mom's spine to the brain, which triggers the release of oxytocin. There it is. And so that oxytocin goes down and causes the myometrium, smooth muscle, to contract, which presses the baby's head again against the cervix, and that results in that signal going up to the brain again saying, hey, which causes more oxytocin to be released. And so notice we're getting sort of a vicious circle, a loop that's building up more and more. The more the baby's head presses, there's the signal. It goes up to her brain and causes oxytocin to be released. And so that causes the myometrium to contract, which presses the baby's head even harder against the cervix, which then causes that signal to go up to the brain again, and which causes the brain to release more oxytocin. And so these contractions start building on themselves. They get more forceful as the labor progresses. All right, good. So these contractions are oftentimes the mom's first notice that she's going through labor. Okay, so let's look at the stages of labor. These contractions are part of the first stage, which is called the dilation stage. And dilation means when something gets larger. And they call it the dilation stage because what's dilating is the cervix. As the myometrium is contracting, thanks to that oxytocin hormone, the baby's head is pressing against the cervix, and that starts to slowly open up the cervix to a larger and larger size. The dilation stage typically takes around 6 to 12 hours. If it's the mom's first time she's giving birth, the dilation stage tends to be longer, but if she's had babies before, the dilation stage tends to be a little bit shorter. And typically sometime during the dilation stage, that amniotic sac will tear, and then that amniotic fluid leaks out, and her water has broken, as they say it, and that means the baby is on its way. Okay, so first stage is the dilation stage. And when the cervix, the opening at the uterus is completely dilated, as wide as it's going to get, then it's now time for what's called the expulsion stage, which starts when the cervix is fully dilated until the baby comes out of the mom's body. And again, that sort of depends on if the woman's given birth before. If it's her first time through, it may be an hour or so or longer. But if she had babies before, the dilation stage, the expulsion stage seems to go faster. All right, and here we see, here's the dilation stage. There's the baby's head pressing against the cervix there. That's the start of the dilation stage. And then eventually the cervix is opening wider, and from when it reaches its maximum opening until the baby is born, that's the expulsion stage, as the baby is coming out. There we go. The babies tend to run a little short on oxygen as they are being born, which is why sometimes our babies are bluish when they're being born. Remember, blue coloration of the skin is called cyanosis, and it comes from the blood being low in oxygen. And a little bit of low oxygen won't hurt the baby. They're sort of designed to be a little bit low on oxygen at that stage. Oh yeah, why are they low on oxygen? Well, they haven't taken their first breath of air yet. They just haven't emerged enough for that. But during the birthing process, the placenta is tearing, and the umbilical cord sometimes gets a little bit compressed, and so they're not getting as much oxygen as they usually would from the mom's blood. So less oxygen from the mom's blood, but also haven't taken their first breath of air yet, is just a low oxygen period. And so, like I say, a little bit of low oxygen is not a big deal. If it goes on for too long, that could have unhealthy repercussions for the baby, because part of the brain tissues could be damaged by the low oxygen. And as an example, there's a partial paralysis of a young person's limbs that's called cerebral palsy. And they're not 100% sure what causes it, but one theory is that the baby was deprived of too much oxygen during the birthing process, and so maybe parts of the brain that control the limbs were damaged. And so if the doctors think that the expulsion stage is going to be long enough so that the baby might be harmed, they can recommend what's called a cesarean section or a C-section. And in the C-section, instead of the baby coming out through the cervix and the vagina, the doctors do a surgical incision in the mom's abdomen and remove the baby like that. And so in that sense, it's safer for the baby. It's more difficult from the mom because the doctors have to make an incision through her abdominal muscles, and that takes a long time to heal. She'll be very painful in her abdominal region for several weeks after that. All right, so expulsion stage is from full dilation of the cervix to the time the baby is born, typically an hour for the first birth, but shorter for subsequent births. After the baby is born, the woman has to also pass the placenta out of her uterus. If it stays inside there, it can lead to infections. And so that's called the placental stage. The contractions of the uterus continue, and that helps propel the placenta outside the woman's body. Question? Yeah, I wasn't going to go there, but different cultures have different traditions with the placenta, and in some cultures they make it into a kind of a stew, and you serve it to people. I've also heard in some cultures it's buried in you plant a tree, you put it in the ground and plant a tree over it. Kind of interesting. All right. So anyway, so that's the last. Those are the three stages of labor: the dilation stage, the expulsion stage, and then the placental stage when the placenta leaves the woman's body. Okay, and then after the placental stage, the labor is done, and you get a baby. There's my kid right there and my wife right there when she was just born. She's 12 now, so she's a little bigger than that, as you could imagine. And here's me holding her tiny little hand. It kind of blows my mind how small people are when they're first born. I mean, how small are those little bones and tissues and stuff in the fingers and things like that.
And now we've brought a new human being into the world. And that ends this lecture on the reproductive system. And in fact, that is the end of the last lecture for this Biology 6 Physiology lecture course. So I want to thank each of you for being my students this semester. I hope you've gained some valuable knowledge from this course that will help you in your future courses and in your future careers. And as always, I recommend that you now do the review questions on this lecture topic. So thank you again, and best of luck on the final. Take care, everybody.